It all began on a warm Saturday morning in early spring, the kind of morning when the air smells of freshly cut grass and the neighborhood feels alive with families pulling out bikes, children playing on sidewalks, and the occasional hum of lawnmowers in the distance. My neighborhood, tucked into a suburban community governed by a notoriously strict homeowners association, was meant to be peaceful. But anyone who had lived there long enough knew peace was only an illusion under the HOA's iron grip. The president of our HOA, a woman named Margaret, took her role with almost military seriousness. To her, every crack in the sidewalk, every misaligned trash can, and every blade of grass out of place was a personal affront to the standards of excellence she claimed to uphold. Many residents had already felt the sting of her excessive fines, but up until then I had managed to keep my property within the invisible boundaries she set. That was until that fateful Saturday morning. When I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, I noticed an envelope taped neatly to my front door. The stark white paper stood out against the dark wood, and the bold letters across the top read, "Notice of Violation." My stomach sank. As I tore it open and read the words inside, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. According to Margaret and the HOA board, I was being fined for failure to maintain lawn standards. The reasoning? My grass was allegedly over the approved length of 2 inches, a rule I hadn't even known existed. I had mowed my lawn just last week, and though it wasn't perfectly manicured like a golf course, it looked perfectly fine by any reasonable measure. But to the HOA, reason had nothing to do with it. They claimed I had violated their landscaping policy and slapped me with a $250 fine. At first, I felt a wave of indignation. Surely this was a mistake. I walked across my yard, measuring the grass with my fingers as though that would prove anything. It wasn't wild, it wasn't unkempt, it was just grass growing as grass does. Yet here I was, singled out and punished. As the day went on, I tried to brush it off. I thought about calling Margaret to clear up the issue, but decided against it. Everyone knew that speaking directly with her was like arguing with a brick wall. She thrived on confrontation, feeding off the control she had over the community. So I paid the fine, grumbling under my breath, and convinced myself it would be a one-time thing. But it wasn't. 2 weeks later, another envelope appeared. Another violation. This time, the fine was doubled, $500, with the same accusation. Failure to maintain lawn standards. My frustration turned into anger. I had mowed my lawn only 3 days earlier, and yet the HOA claimed it was non-compliant. I began to notice Margaret walking past my house more often, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes. It felt less like oversight and more like harassment. I started asking around the neighborhood and soon discovered I wasn't alone. My next-door neighbor had been fined for having a non-regulation mailbox. A family down the street had been penalized for leaving a bicycle in their driveway overnight. Another resident had even been fined because their garbage can was visible for a few minutes too long after pickup. It was clear Margaret was running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, and the rest of us were her unwilling subjects. The tipping point came when I received a third letter, this one threatening legal action if I didn't pay the escalating fines. The amount now totaled nearly $1,000, all because of my so-called unacceptable lawn. The injustice burned in my chest. I knew I couldn't just keep paying and hoping it would end. Something had to change. That night, I pulled out the thick binder of HOA bylaws, a document most residents shoved in the back of a drawer and never looked at again. I pored over the dense legal language, page after page, searching for any clause, any contradiction, any possible leverage. And after hours of reading, something caught my eye. It was small, almost hidden, but it made my pulse quicken. Buried in the landscaping section, there was a vague but critical line. Lawn length shall be maintained in accordance with the regional average as deemed acceptable by municipal code. I sat back in my chair, realizing what this meant. The HOA's fines weren't based on municipal code at all. They were based on Margaret's personal preference. If I could prove that the local government had no such restrictions, then all of her fines could be invalidated. It was a crack in the armor, a potential loophole. And I intended to exploit it. But if I was going to take on Margaret and the HOA, I would have to be careful. This wasn't just about grass anymore. It was about power, control, and principle. The road ahead would not be easy, but I had no intention of backing down. And so, with the binder of bylaws in my lap and a growing determination in my heart, I began plotting my revenge. What started as a ridiculous fine over a lawn was about to turn into a battle that would shake the entire HOA to its core. The war with Margaret had just begun. The discovery of that single line in the HOA bylaws felt like stumbling upon buried treasure. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The wording was clear. Lawn length must align with municipal code. That meant if the city had no strict measurement standard, Margaret's enforcement was nothing but overreach. The fines, the threats, the harassment, it could all be challenged. But I knew better than to rush into battle unprepared. I began my investigation quietly. The first step was to check with the local municipal offices. I spent an afternoon scouring the city's public records, poring over property maintenance codes. What I found was exactly what I had hoped for. There was no specific rule about grass height. The only regulation on the books concerned noxious weeds, or yards that were demonstrably unsafe or unsanitary. My neatly trimmed lawn didn't even come close to violating those standards. With that confirmation in hand, I made copies of the municipal code and tucked them away like ammunition. But I wasn't done yet. If I was going to take on Margaret and the HOA, I would need more than just technicalities. I needed a strategy that not only protected me but also exposed her pattern of abuse against the entire neighborhood. So I began speaking with my neighbors. At first, they were hesitant. Everyone knew that complaining about the HOA could make you a target. But as soon as I mentioned the bylaws and the municipal code, something shifted. People started opening up. One family shared how they'd been fined nearly $1,000 for having unapproved exterior paint, even though the color was practically identical to what the HOA had pre-approved. Another neighbor had been hit with late fees for not paying dues they had actually paid on time, forcing them into a months-long dispute. Someone else revealed they were told to cut down a tree that the city had planted decades ago simply because Margaret decided it didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. The stories poured out like a flood. Each violation, each fine, each humiliation was a thread in a larger web of control Margaret had spun around the community. And now, with evidence that her enforcement contradicted the very bylaws she was sworn to uphold, I realized I might be holding the key to unraveling that web. But exposing her would require more than quiet conversations. I needed documentation. Over the next few weeks, I began collecting copies of violation letters from anyone willing to share them. I kept meticulous notes, recording dates, amounts, and the supposed infractions. I snapped photos of properties before and after alleged violations, noting how arbitrary the rules seemed to be. Piece by piece, I built a case file that painted Margaret not as a leader enforcing community standards, but as a tyrant using the HOA as her personal weapon. Still, I knew Margaret would not back down easily. Her personality thrived on authority, and her power was rooted in fear. If I was going to challenge her, I needed to do it in a way that couldn't be ignored. That meant taking the fight to the HOA board itself. The board meetings were held once a month in the community clubhouse, and attendance was usually sparse. Most residents avoided them because they knew it would just be Margaret droning on about rules and fines. But the next meeting, I decided, would be different. I would show up with my evidence, my research, and my determination. And if things went as planned, I wouldn't be going alone. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, I began quietly rallying my neighbors. I explained the loophole, showed them the municipal code, and shared how Margaret's enforcement didn't hold up under scrutiny. One by one, people started nodding in agreement. They were tired of living under constant threat, tired of feeling like their own homes weren't truly theirs. By the end of the month, I had a small but motivated group ready to stand with me. The night of the board meeting finally arrived. I remember the nervous energy in the air as we gathered outside the clubhouse. Normally, only a handful of residents showed up, but that night, the room was packed. People who had never attended before were suddenly eager to hear what would unfold. Margaret, seated at the front of the room with her ever-present clipboard, looked pleased at the turnout. She probably assumed it was a show of support for her leadership. She had no idea what was coming. As the meeting began, Margaret ran through her usual agenda: updates on community dues, reminders about maintenance standards, and a new PID proposal to increase penalties for repeat violations. But then it was time for the open forum, the portion of the meeting where residents could bring up concerns. That was my moment. I stood, folder in hand, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. I laid out my case, starting with the lawn fines, showing the board and the gathered residents the municipal code, the bylaw wording, and the evidence of her misapplication of the rules. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as I turned page after page, presenting not just my story, but the collective experiences of dozens of neighbors who had suffered under her reign. Margaret's face turned red, her usual composure cracking as she tried to interrupt, but the board couldn't ignore the weight of the evidence. For the first time, Margaret was on the defensive, and I knew this was only the beginning, because exposing her at the meeting was just the first step. The real battle would come afterward, when Margaret, backed into a corner, would try to retaliate, and I was ready for it. The night of the board meeting ended with a mixture of triumph and tension. On the one hand, I had succeeded in shining a light on Margaret's questionable enforcement. Residents who had once felt powerless were now emboldened, whispering about forming a coalition to hold the HOA accountable. On the other hand, I knew Margaret well enough to understand that she would not take humiliation lightly. For someone who thrived on control, being exposed in front of the community was intolerable. The first sign of retaliation came the very next morning. When I opened my front door, I found not one but 3 violation notices crammed into my mailbox. Each letter cited a different offense. One accused me of leaving my trash bin out past the designated pickup time, though I had brought it in promptly the day before. Another claimed my driveway had excessive staining, despite the fact it had been pressure washed just a week earlier. The third was almost laughable. It said I had an unauthorized ornament in my front yard, referring to the small bird bath that had been there since the day I moved in. Margaret wasn't even pretending anymore. This was targeted harassment, a clear message that she intended to make my life miserable for daring to challenge her authority. At first, I felt the familiar burn of frustration. The thought of yet another round of fines was exhausting, and part of me wanted to crumple up the letters and pretend they didn't exist. But then I remembered the thick folder of evidence I had compiled. I wasn't defenseless anymore. This time, I would not quietly pay the fines and hope for peace. This time, I would fight back. I began by meticulously documenting everything. I photographed my trash bin tucked neatly inside my garage. I snapped images of my spotless driveway from multiple angles. I even measured the bird bath and checked the HOA's design guidelines, which said nothing about yard ornaments of that size. I sent formal responses to the HOA, attaching all the evidence, and demanded that the violations be withdrawn. But Margaret, predictably, was not moved by facts. A week later, I received another letter, this one far more aggressive. It claimed that my repeated violations were grounds for legal action and threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't comply. That was when I realized this battle was escalating beyond petty fines. Margaret was attempting to use the full weight of the HOA to crush me into submission. The thought of losing my home because of this power-hungry president sent chills down my spine, but fear quickly gave way to resolve. If Margaret wanted war, I was ready to give it to her. I reached out to the growing network of neighbors who had voiced their frustration at the board meeting. Slowly, a plan began to form. We weren't just going to defend ours, elves individually. We were going to act collectively. Each time Margaret issued a violation, we would document, share, and compare. If her rulings contradicted the bylaws or municipal code, we would build a shared file of evidence. Within weeks, the file grew thicker than I could have imagined. One neighbor received a notice for excessively bright holiday lighting in the middle of March when no decorations were even up. Another was cited for a non-compliant mailbox that had been installed by the developer before they even moved in. The sheer absurdity of Margaret's campaign became undeniable. Still, Margaret continued her crusade against me personally. She began sending anonymous complaints to city inspectors, hoping they would find faults that could bypass the HOA bylaws. Inspectors showed up at my door, only to leave empty-handed when they found everything in order. Each failed attempt only fueled her anger further. The tension in the neighborhood became palpable. People began to take sides. Some fearful of Margaret's power and unwilling to get involved, others emboldened by the growing resistance. At block parties and casual gatherings, whispers turned into open conversations. Why do we let her do this? How much longer can she get away with it? The atmosphere shifted. Margaret was no longer seen as a respected authority, but as a bully who had finally pushed too far. Meanwhile, I continued digging deeper into the HOA's own operations. I reviewed the financial statements that were supposed to be transparent to all residents. What I discovered was alarming. Vague expense categories, large unexplained withdrawals, and reimbursements paid directly to Margaret for administrative duties. I didn't yet have proof of wrongdoing, but it was enough to raise serious questions. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that Margaret's grip on power wasn't just about lawns and trash cans. It was about money, influence, and control. If I could expose not only her misuse of the rules, but also potential financial mismanagement, her reign as HOA president could be over for good. But with each step forward, the danger increased. Margaret wasn't going to let her empire crumble without a fight. And as the next board meeting approached, I knew she would use it as a stage to reassert her authority and try to paint me as the villain. I wasn't afraid. I had evidence, I had allies, and most importantly, I had the truth. What began as a ridiculous fine over the length of my grass had turned into a battle for the very soul of our neighborhood. And when that next meeting came, I was determined not just to defend myself, but to finally put Margaret on the defensive in front of everyone. The weeks leading up to the next HOA board meeting felt like a build-up to a storm. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Whispers of discontent grew louder, and for the first time in years, residents spoke of hope. Hope that the cycle of arbitrary fines and intimidation could be broken. Meanwhile, Margaret, sensing her authority slipping, doubled down. More violation notices went out, more threats were issued, and her tone in letters became increasingly hostile. But something had shifted. The residents weren't cowering anymore. They were documenting, filing, and quietly rallying together. For the first time, Margaret's tactics weren't met with silence. They were being met with organized resistance. The night of the board meeting, the clubhouse was packed to capacity. Chairs filled every corner, and people stood along the walls just to witness what would unfold. The atmosphere was thick with tension, like a courtroom on the verge of delivering a verdict. Margaret sat at the front, stiff-backed, her clipboard resting in her lap as if it were a shield. Around her, the other board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the hostile energy in the room. Margaret opened the meeting with her usual monotone, reciting agenda points that sounded irrelevant in the face of growing unrest. Dues collection, landscaping reminders, proposals for stricter penalties. It was business as usual for her. But everyone knew the real subject of the night wasn't on the printed agenda. When the open forum began, I rose from my seat. Folder in hand, I walked to the front of the room. My voice carried not just my frustration, but the collective anger of the community. I laid out the evidence in a steady rhythm, starting with my own case, the false violations, the municipal codes that disproved the HOA's enforcement, and the blatant contradiction within the bylaws. Then, I expanded. One by one, I presented the stories of my neighbors, copies of violation letters, photographs of properties, documented inconsistencies. With each example, the crowd murmured louder. People who had once felt alone now realized they were part of something bigger. Margaret's so-called authority was unraveling, and everyone could see it. Her face flushed with anger. Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp and brittle. She accused me of fabricating evidence, of manipulating my neighbors, of attempting to destabilize the HOA. But her words only made her desperation more obvious. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught between loyalty to their president and the undeniable weight of the evidence in front of them. I didn't stop there. I moved on to the financial statements, projecting them for everyone to see. Line by line, I pointed out the vague categories, the reimbursements paid directly to Margaret, the unexplained withdrawals. I didn't make accusations I couldn't prove, but I asked the questions aloud. Why were these expenses so unclear? Why did residents' dues appear to be funding things no one had approved? The room erupted in gay, SPS, and whispers. For years, people had blindly trusted the HOA with their money, assuming it was handled responsibly. Now, doubt spread like wildfire. Margaret's composure cracked further. She banged her gavel against the table, insisting the discussion was out of order, but the crowd no longer listened. Neighbors shouted questions, demanding answers. The board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing their own reputations were on the line if they stood with her. What happened next was a turning point. A neighbor who had been fined thousands of dollars for supposed landscaping violations stood up and announced that they had already contacted an attorney about suing the HOA. Another resident chimed in, saying they were prepared to file a petition to remove Margaret as president. The energy in the room shifted from outrage to determination. Margaret wasn't just losing control, she was facing a full-scale rebellion. I ended my presentation with a simple statement. The HOA was meant to serve the community, not terrorize it. If the current leadership couldn't honor that purpose, then it was time for new leadership. The applause that followed shook the room. Margaret sat frozen, her authority crumbling in front of her eyes. She tried to regain control, calling for order, threatening to adjourn the meeting, but the board itself stopped her. For the first time, they sided with the residents, agreeing to schedule a formal review of the financial records and an emergency vote on Margaret's position. The meeting ended in chaos, but for once, it was the chaos of change, not fear. Neighbors left with a sense of empowerment, whispering plans for petitions and committees. The tide had turned. Margaret, once untouchable, now sat on the edge of losing everything she had clung to so tightly. As I walked home that night, the cool air felt electric. The battle wasn't over. Margaret would undoubtedly fight back with everything she had. But now, she was no longer the unquestioned ruler of the neighborhood. She was a cornered figure, desperate to cling to power. And a cornered figure is often the most dangerous. The days after the explosive board meeting were strangely quiet. For a brief moment, the neighborhood seemed to exhale, as though the collective weight of Margaret's control had lifted, even just slightly. But silence didn't mean safety. Deep down, I knew Margaret wasn't done. She had been embarrassed, her authority undermined, her finances questioned in front of the very people she lorded over. For someone like her, that kind of humiliation could only lead to one thing: revenge. It didn't take long to arrive. The first act of retaliation came in the form of a certified letter slipped into my mailbox. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA, claiming I owed nearly $3,000 in accumulated fines and late fees. According to the letter, my so-called violations had compounded, and if I didn't pay immediately, the HOA would begin foreclosure proceedings against my home. The absurdity of it all might have been laughable if it hadn't been so dangerous. A lien on my property wasn't just a threat. It could mean losing my house, the very place I had worked so hard to protect. Margaret wasn't just trying to scare me anymore. She was trying to destroy me. I took a deep breath and refused to panic. Instead, I gathered every piece of evidence I had collected, every photo, every document, every letter. I contacted an attorney, explaining the situation in detail. When I showed him the municipal codes and the contradictions in the HOA bylaws, his expression shifted from concern to determination. He assured me Margaret's claims had no legal foundation, and that if she pressed forward, it could expose the HOA to massive liability. Still, Margaret didn't stop. Within a week, code inspectors showed up again at my property, this time claiming they'd received anonymous complaints about unsafe structures. They combed through my yard, inspected the fence, examined the gutters, even peeked under the deck. When they found nothing wrong, they left looking frustrated, as if they'd wasted their time. But I knew who had sent them. Not long after, I began receiving anonymous letters in the mail. They were crudely typed, filled with vague threats about knowing where I live and urging me to leave the neighborhood. My security cameras caught glimpses of Margaret lurking near my property late at night, as though she were searching for new ammunition to use against me. Her desperation was showing, but so was her recklessness. The breaking point came when Margaret, in a last-ditch effort to reassert her authority, called for a special emergency board meeting. Flyers were posted around the neighborhood, announcing that the meeting would address serious misconduct by certain residents, clearly aimed at me. She wanted to paint me as the villain, to convince the community that I was the problem, not her. But what she didn't realize was that her tactics had backfired. By this point, the neighbors she had spent years harassing were no longer afraid of her. They were angry, and they were united. The night of the emergency meeting, the clubhouse overflowed once again. Margaret sat at the head of the table, papers stacked high in front of her, eyes glinting with a mix of fury and desperation. She launched into a tirade about rule breakers and troublemakers, accusing me of undermining the HOA and threatening the stability of the community. She waved around violation notices, financial charts, and supposed evidence of my misconduct. But then, one by one, the residents began to speak. A neighbor stood and revealed how Margaret had fined them for parking in their own driveway. Another explained how they'd been harassed over their holiday decorations. Someone else spoke about the tree Margaret had forced them to cut down, costing thousands. Each story was a nail in the coffin of her credibility. Then came the moment that sealed her fate. One of the neighbors I had quietly worked with presented the compiled financial records I had uncovered, organized, annotated, and undeniable. The vague expense categories, the unexplained withdrawals, the reimbursements paid directly to Margaret, all projected for the room to see. The gasps were louder this time, the whispers angrier. People demanded to know why their dues had been spent this way, why the HOA's money seemed to vanish into Margaret's pocket. For the first time, Margaret's voice faltered. She tried to defend herself, insisting it was all legitimate, but the board members were no longer nodding along. They were pale, nervous, realizing that their own names were on those financial documents. If an investigation came, they too could be held responsible. The room erupted into chaos. Residents demanded a vote. Margaret shouted over them, pounding her gavel, but the noise drowned her out. The once untouchable president was no longer in control. That night ended without resolution, but the shift was undeniable. Margaret had played her final card, and it had backfired spectacularly. Instead of discrediting me, she had exposed her own corruption to the entire community. Walking home, I knew the endgame was near. Margaret was cornered, her power slipping through her fingers. but I also knew that desperate people do desperate things. She wouldn't go down quietly, and I was prepared for whatever she tried next. The emergency meeting had shaken the neighborhood to its core. Margaret's authority, once unquestioned, now hung by a thread. The board members were rattled, the residents were furious, and whispers of petitions and lawsuits spread like wildfire. For years, she had ruled with intimidation and fines, but the cracks in her foundation had widened into gaping fractures. It was only a matter of time before the entire restructure collapsed. In the days that followed, the community moved swiftly. A group of residents, myself included, drafted a formal petition to remove Margaret as president. Signatures came pouring in. People who had once been too afraid to even glance her way now lined up at my doorstep, eager to add their names. Within a week, the petition had enough support to trigger a recall vote, something Margaret had never imagined possible. Word of the petition spread like wildfire, and Margaret fought back the only way she knew how, with more threats. She sent out mass letters warning that removing her would cause irreversible damage to the HOA. She accused those supporting the petition of conspiring to destroy property values. But the more she shouted, the more people tuned her out. The fear she had thrived on was gone, replaced by a quiet determination among the residents to take back their community. When the night of the recall vote arrived, the clubhouse was overflowing once again. This time, however, the energy was different. It wasn't tense or chaotic, it was decisive. People wanted change, and they weren't afraid to show it. Margaret sat at the front of the room, her usual air of superiority gone, replaced by a tight, nervous expression. The board began the proceedings, reading the petition aloud and outlining the rules for the recall vote. Ballots were passed out, and the room fell into a hushed silence as each resident made their choice. For a brief moment, time seemed to stretch endlessly, the weight of years of frustration pressing down on every pen stroke. When the votes were collected and counted, the result was clear. Margaret was out. The announcement was met with cheers, clapping, and even tears of relief. The woman who had fined us, threatened us, and tried to break us had finally lost her throne. But the story didn't end there. In the weeks following her removal, a deeper investigation into the HOA's finances was launched. The vague expenses and questionable reimbursements I had uncovered were only the beginning. Records showed that thousands of dollars had been diverted into personal accounts disguised as administrative costs and consulting fees. What had started as a battle over lawn length had snowballed into a full-blown case of financial misconduct. Margaret's downfall was swift. Facing legal scrutiny, she was forced to repay a significant portion of the funds she had misused. Rumors swirled about further penalties, but for the community, the most important victory had already been won. She no longer held power over us. The HOA underwent sweeping changes. A new board was elected, composed of residents who genuinely cared about maintaining fairness rather than enforcing arbitrary control. Rules were clarified, fines were reduced, and transparency became the new standard. For the first time in years, people felt comfortable in their own homes again. The atmosphere of fear that had lingered over the neighborhood like a storm cloud was gone, replaced by a sense of unity and relief. As for me, I often thought back to the day I found that first violation notice taped to my door. What had started as an infuriating fine over a lawn too long had spiraled into a battle that reshaped an entire community. It hadn't been easy. There were nights I lay awake, wondering if I was making a mistake, if I should just pay the fines and avoid the conflict. But in the end, persistence had paid off. I hadn't just defended my lawn. I had defended the principle that no one should be bullied in their own home. The bird bath remained in my yard. The grass grew freely within reason, and neighbors smiled when they walked past instead of whispering in fear of who might be watching. Our neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was finally ours again. And Margaret? She disappeared from the community shortly after her removal, moving out in the dead of night. Some said she went to another neighborhood, perhaps to try and climb her way back into power somewhere else. But it didn't matter anymore. Her reign here was finished, and the lesson she left behind would not be forgotten.